she's asked. So you got a brochure.
I read through the comments on Slack channel, it's getting a massive complex.
Yeah.
Regarding recruiters and technology. So.
I'm prejudiced, but she's one of the few good.
Cool. All right, so let's talk about Vue. So if you have any questions, or if you want me to stop and explain something at any point tonight, just say it. If I can explain it quickly, I'll explain it while we're in context, and if not, I'll say, hey, let's hit this at the very end. So if people need to take off, they can take off. So tonight we're going to talk about Vue and the Vue ecosystem. So the tool and all of the tools that allow you to use Vue and build cool stuff with it. So to run down the stuff that we're going to cover, we'll go over what Vue.js is at a general level. We'll talk about the various tools that make up the ecosystem that are Vue directly or work really well with Vue. We're going to talk about a couple of different concepts, and while I'm going to cover Vue specifically and use Vue as like a lens to talk about explore Vue specifically, I also want to use it as a lens to talk about more general concepts like two-way binding and component development and MVVM architecture and stuff like that, which span beyond Vue, but Vue does a good job of showing it off. We'll talk about the bits and pieces about it, how to debug, the concept of shared state and stores, client-side routing, and ancillary tools, and you guys could read all that, so I probably didn't need to read it off, but let's dive in. So what is Vue.js? So I'm assuming everybody has heard of Vue here. If you've not heard of Vue, it is a JavaScript tool used for building user interfaces that can either be used as something to pepper in interaction or to build out more robust single-page applications. The core library of Vue, like Vue.js, like capital V, is really centered only on presentation logic. Vue is not trying to be a be-all, end-all for your system. Like if you pull something like Angular in, or if you're familiar with Sencha/EXTJS, or even Ember, as I understand it, they kind of want to be the entire thing for you. Vue is really just a JavaScript library focused on presentation logic. It doesn't even do asynchronous calls. You have to bring something else in for that. So just focus on presentation presentation, and I would say also front-end business logic. To take a very brief detour, there's the concept of presentation logic, which is how are you going to display data to your users? How are you going to display the tools to interact with that data, and how you whenever they make changes. But there's also the concept of front-end business logic. So usually when we think of business logic, we think of the server side. Like once you have the data, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to store it? How is it going to interact with other places? There's also a concept of front-end business logic. If you're building a single page application, some of that thinking that you would normally hand off to the back end, you have an opportunity to do on the front end. And the way that I tend to think about it whenever I'm building out applications, I usually build server-side API, JavaScript client, they talk via API routes. And when I think about it, the front end, which is Vue and all of its tools, tends to be how am I going to present this to the user, and then how am I going to organize everything so that whenever I hand off to the server has for the most part, what it needs to do its job, like what the information from the user that it needs to do its job, and then its business logic can be what am I going to do with this information past that. So focus on presentation logic, but it really allows you to do front-end business logic as well. Vue is intended to be incrementally adoptable. Well, we'll kind of see this as we step through the demos that I built for tonight's presentation, but you can fit Vue in at a very, very light level, and then step it up really easily into something a little bit more complex. And then it's part of that is that it's easy to integrate with other tools. Like I said, Vue's only concerned with the presentation logic, so you need to bring in other tools to do other interactions. The Vue seeks to make that super easy, and is not trying to push other stuff out. So the Vue ecosystem boils down to Vue.js, so the code that does that presentation logic. Vuex, which is an optional store pattern, that you can bring into do a little bit more sophisticated organization of your data. Vue router, which allows for client-side routing between parts of your application. And then third-party tools like Axios or like even jQuery if you want to use that for asynchronous calls, or Lodash if you needed to bring that in for specific parsing, or any other tool that you would need to do something that is outside of the scope of what Vue is trying to cover. And then I put separately third-party styling tools. I call out Vuetify specifically because it's going to be in some of the demos. But Vue also, it's not trying to be your bootstrap. It is like it's up to you to do all of your styling, but there are packages that you can use that build out more generic Vue components that you could take advantage of as you build out your custom application. And then the rest of the ecosystem is the tools that you use to either get started or continue developing, which is the command line tools for Vue, the project level templates so that you're not starting from absolute scratch every single time, dev tools, loaders like JavaScript build tools, and then something that's a little bit newer is the Vue style guide that came out late 2017 as kind of a way of helping give a general good and bad practices when developing Vue code. So the core idea under Vue that everything centers around, that everything builds off of, is this concept of two-way binding. If you've not heard of two-way binding from either Vue or other tools, it is a way of linking your UI, so the view that you're showing to your users, and the data in your application, to decouple them, but then also allow you to work back and forth between Vue and data. It's also a way of being able to link data in one part of your application to data in another, and to make it reactive. So the idea is that whenever a user manipulates a piece of data that is also linked to another part of the UI, there's a background updating of the information, so that you're not having to explicitly say, I'm updating this, so make sure you go and update something else. You're really just linking the pieces of your UI or the different pieces of the data to each other by referencing them, saying this is the main piece of data. So whenever you see this input field that is associated with that, keep the data in the view and sync.
I don't know if this is something you could touch on quickly, but it seems to me that in Angular 1 days, people thought two-way data binding is just really cool. And the more people used it, I think they got themselves into a mess, and the code was hard to understand. And then React came along and they said, the problem is we're using two-way data binding. We need to have this one state, like the Redux approach, and everything you do updates that state, and then that comes back through your component, and your component just renders based on what is passed to it that came from the state. And now it seems like with Vue, we're going back and saying, well, maybe two-way data binding was okay.
So the interesting thing about that is that the concept of two-way data binding and the way that the data and the UI are updated is by referencing the data and your view, but the data flow is that one-way communication. Whenever we like at a very simple level, like with just Vue components, before you bring in something like Vuex, no, I think that changes well. I think it's always a one-way data flow, because there are pieces even outside of Vuex, which is analogous to Flux or Redux. There are pieces of the documentation that say, make sure that you don't link your data this way, because after the view tasks run, it's going to re-render everything and then overwrite it because you did it that way. And because I'm presenting right now, I can't remember exactly where in the documentation it is. But yeah, like there is a one-way data flow. It's just a circular one-way data flow that allows it to seem like two-way binding. So and I do spell that out a little bit better.
Okay, Chris.
Yes.
I have our first bad question.
Yep.
So I'm not a front-end guy. I've did a couple of Angular meetups and maybe a Angular meetup.
Mm-hmm.
And the two-way data bot, I remember something about their chain, something like that. That is one of the issues where I guess was a drain on resources or something like that.
Angular has.
Yeah, I think because that's how Angular 1 did on the check, but I think like you like React does like a virtual DOM.
Yeah.
On the DOM, virtual performance. Yeah, we've been using Vue I work. I really love it. I started out with Angular 1 and I like the two-way binding. It's not the sharpest even tool in the shed, but I don't get why two-way binding isn't good anymore. I don't know. But definitely maybe it's the Angular 1 way. I think it was more of a not necessarily a performance issue, more of a reasoning issue, right? Or like trying to
Exactly. Like where did this one piece of data come from? Is it easy to answer that?
yeah. I never had a problem with that. Maybe I have to do something collect better.
Yeah. I'm hoping that some of the examples that I show will help show that it's not like it's because I haven't really had a big issue with it, and like as much as I feel like I'm able to talk on the subject, I'm not an expert on it, so I could have something wrong as well. Yeah. I think that the important part of two-way data binding, or even if you're talking about the single directional flow of information, is like, or one of the most important parts of it is getting moving away from storing your data in the DOM, like in your actual markup and stuff, either through data elements or by writing code that walks the DOM tree and then like looks for their HTML and stuff like that. Moving that out to JavaScript objects so that it's easier to reason about, it's easier to see, it's easier to extend or build off of. It's easier to look at a page or even look at a series of files and really understand what you're seeing without having to do a bunch of mental backflips to actually see the data from the structure, or see the data from the visuals, from the UI. It also allows us to compose components together that have their own isolated worlds without coupling them together. So whenever we look at a Vue component, and this is, I'll pull up an actual file so we can see it. This is the entire world for this particular component. Like we're not, we are isolated within here. The Vue component is made up of the template that is the part of the UI that the user is going to see, the data properties within it, which is the pieces of your data, or the calculations, like the computed pieces of your data. So like a really quick example of like a computed data property is, I have a data property that is first name, I have a data property that is last name, I have a computed data property that is full name, that takes those two data properties, concatenates them together, and spits them out as if it's its own data property. Or data that's passed in. If data is handed to a Vue component, it is explicitly handed into it. You are not looking for some global data that could be there, could not be there. It's something that is being passed in either by a data property or pulled in by a shared state. The other pieces of a Vue, so template up here, which is your regular markup. Your data properties, which center around here. We're not seeing anything computed at the moment. Your methods, which are the functions, like the operations that that your component would want to do. If you have a component that has first name, last name, and then like you want it to have like show an alert that says hello and then full name, the the click trigger would call a function down here that actually says that triggers the alert to say hi. There are other pieces like lifecycle hooks. So what to do when the Vue component is at various stages of creation, running, or destruction. Let's see, something that's not up here is other components that are inserted. So when I talked about composing Vue components before, you can have a Vue component that has other components nested within it. And they are in their own isolated state, but they're knitted together by inserting them as other components. Well, I'll show a live example. Hopefully it'll be a little bit more clear. And then the style. With Vue components, you can, so what we're seeing right here is a .vue file. You can write Vue just into regular separated out HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files. And I'm not going to show any of that because that's just not how I build usually. But the other option is to have like all the bits and pieces of your component in one file so you can see it all at the same time. Because of that, you can include the style for your component, and you can either have it be a general style that cascades the exact same way as everything else, which is like something you should use sparingly, or you can scope it to say this style that you see here only applies to this markup here. Doesn't cascade up, doesn't cascade down. So let's look at some real code. So almost all the code that I'm going to show tonight is up on my GitHub, and I will post the link to that. So don't worry about scribbling anything down. You'll be able to walk through it later. Oh. Oh yeah. We won't see any instances of that in the demo code, but whenever I show the code base that I worked on for work, we'll see both extension and mixins. But those are really like you can think of extension the same way you think about regular object-oriented extension. I have a parent class that has some general information that I want my subclass to have, and then I have my subclass that has specific information that is now inherited from the parent class. So it's the same thing with components. It's the same thing asterisk with components. There are a couple of differences, and then mixins, which are the same as like if you're familiar with PHP traits. They're ways of getting around the single inheritance model. Like you can include methods and like bits and pieces of components into your Vue component, even if you've extended another one. They're just kind of tacked in.
So distinctly separate from like a JavaScript import.
Yes, because and I don't go into detail on mixin, so I'll hit it right here. We can actually look at the demo code, and I'll come back through and explain more about this. But when it comes to mixins, everything that is the business logic of your Vue component is here in this JavaScript object that you're exporting. It has all the bits and pieces of your component. Whenever you use a Vue mixin, like a Vue specific mixin, it is bringing in it. You are creating another component, like the general shape of another component, and then you're inserting into this component with a merge policy. So if you have data properties that match the component that you're inserting into, will override the mixin. Otherwise, like if you had a method that was say hi in your mixin, it will get inserted with the methods. You could still do your regular import, like import Axios and then use Axios directly, but you would have to explicitly put Axios where you want it to be. With the mixin, it just merges it into where it would be normally, given the specific structure of a Vue component. So starting all the way out, whenever we're looking at a Vue file, it get the this project is built using Webpack, so we have an entry point file, this main.js, and Webpack bundles it all up, and it gets inserted into the app here. Vue is going to look for a specific ID that you give it, or even a class if you want to use a class, but a specific identifier that is going to be its domain whenever it gets inserted. So for this page, Vue is going to be in the domain of this div. It won't affect anything outside of this. If we had this nested within other markup, it wouldn't mess with the other markup. It wouldn't even know about the stuff in the other markup. Its domain is specifically this div, unless you like window or document reach out. So our entry point is this main.js file. That's where we import our Vue library, and we import the app that we're going to insert where our div was. We create a new Vue instance. We tell it where it's going to live, and then we use a render function. So if you're familiar with React, I think JSX is all render functions? I haven't actually worked with React, so I'm not totally sure. But React uses render functions to actually build up the DOM. Vue can do that as well, but you usually just write regular templates because the community considers that a little bit easier to read. But there's a render function that says, hey, take that component and then shove it wherever this element is. So looking at our first component, this is going to be the general app that we're looking at. We can look at this template and know that it's going to draw a div. It's going to draw a div. It's going to replace our ID so that we can attach some styles to it and stuff. And then here's our first custom component that we're going to insert. You could within Vue, you could just write all of your markup for all the stuff that you're going to use directly into this this first app.vue. You don't have to split it out into other components. It's just good organization, and especially when you come back to it later, an easier way to think about your application itself. Actually, hold on. So one of the things I should do is give context. So let me spin this example up. So this is what we're looking at. It's a simple color picker. We have control over the text color. Where's my picker? Oh, come on. Sorry about that. So we have control over the text color, and then we have control over the background color. So that's all, and then we have a reset button to take everything back to black and white. So given that that's what we're going for, our app is really just kind of like a thin wrapper around this because we're only inserting one component within the app. And then what we're looking at on screen is this color picker.vue component. So stepping through the bits and pieces, there is a template which is all the markup that's used to render out the stuff that we're seeing on the screen. There is the view model, which is all of our presentation logic, and if you're building something more complex, any of the front end business logic involved in this particular component. And then there's all the style that is used to make the component look the way that it looks. So whenever we talk about two-way data binding, what we do is in our template there you can see various references to things like the background color, to this V model text color. So those are really just references. We're saying this is going to be linked to this particular data property within our view model. And then when we look further down in our view model, we see the text color, we see the background color. and then we see the logic of how they're interacting. There's not any logic of saying, okay, whenever someone like clicked on that color picker and set it to this particular spot on that wheel, then go to this data element and update it to be this hexadecimal value. The mere fact that we have an input type or an input that's type color means that we get that UI element that's going to set the color, and then the data that it gives is just automatically going to be put into the text color. So really, if we didn't worry about this reset button, the only thing that we would need to make this work are these two data properties. One that's controlling text color, one that's controlling background color. Does that make sense? Fit? It knows, so our data property text color is written in camel case this way, and whenever the template's being rendered out, it knows that its context is the component that it's associated with. So whenever we say text color here, it knows that it's talking about the data property text color. So really, you're just writing in the name of the data property, and that's how it's linked.
The V model is a view-specific attribute to the HTML.
Right. This
in Angular, when we go, it's like square brackets inside of parentheses. And then it knows in the template, okay, look for this variable.
gotcha.
So in Angular 2, that's the equivalent of an HTML.
Yeah. So
Square brackets.
Yeah.
But they're just putting it straight on the attributes.
yeah, the V model attribute specifically says bind this to the data property in the view model.
And then the colons next to the style is what designates it as a background.
Yep. Yeah. This is the same as v bind.
Okay.
So it's shorthand, but it's another way of binding.
Cool.
Binding.
That's what I was looking for, was just using the template.
Gotcha.
Like, hey, this is like this.
Yep, and that's something that I didn't spell out. I use a lot of shorthands. So the colon in an attribute is equivalent to vbind. If we were talking about when we're talking about events, the @ is equivalent of v on, and the shorthands are really just there so that it's a little bit less verbose.
Chris, in the previous file, you had name equals qualities.
Oh yeah, and I'm not even using it there. So Vue allows for preprocessors, and each of those so the main tags are template, script, and style. And Vue, if you give it the name of a preprocessor, it will pass the stuff within that tag through the preprocessor. So I'm not using Pug here. This is actually just part of a snippet. So I'm actually pleasantly surprised that it will parse HTML. The Pug will do that, not spit out an error message. But in future examples, I get into Pug because that's kind of the way I like writing now. It will pass that through the Pug loader in Webpack as it's going through. Same thing with SCSS. So I'm able to write. I don't think I have anything specifically SCSS in here. I have it in here. Yeah, so like the nested style that you could do with SCSS, I'm able to write that directly in there and then just tell Webpack's view loader, hey, when you process this tag, process it with the SCSS loader. So and to peek into that,
You can also use ES6 and ES5, right?
Yep. Yeah, the JavaScript is automatically going to pass through Babel, just as part of the view loader. So if you have a Webpack set up, you can run your Vue components through the view loader. That will take all of these individual component files, parse each of the individual pieces, and then turn it into browser-friendly code. And this is where you could say, okay, I want you, whenever you hit SCSS, I want you to use this series of regular Webpack loaders, SAS this series. The JavaScript and templates are just handled as part of the regular Vue loader lifecycle. And I don't even need to specify Pug at this level. All I have to do is say, pass it through Pug and make sure that my package.json, like make sure that I've installed Pug, and it will just grab it and use it. So something that I think will also help hopefully solidify some of the concepts that we're seeing here, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the debugging, but it's one of the best ways of looking through a Vue component. Vue has its own set of dev tools for Chrome and Firefox, and you can use those, bring them up, and then look at your individual components and look at the data properties within them, and then like more information as our app gets more complex. But here you can see that. So this is our template. So we're seeing the stuff that our template's spitting out. This is our model. Like this is the actual data within the Vue component. So as we go through and change it, you can actually see the two-way binding or the mock two-way binding happening, where it's just making sure that as we change things in the Vue is being reflected in the model, and then anything else that's tied to that, like we're tying these input elements here to our Vue model, but then we're then going back and tying these model properties to the background color for the text, or the color for the text and the background color for the component directly. So there's no saying, okay, the color changed to this, so change this into the Vue model. That's just happening automatically, and there's no saying, okay, this data property in the Vue model changed, so change the background color. It's just we reference the text color here, and then in the style we reference the text color there, and that's all we need to do to link those two.
So what would give you, I guess my problem always with Angular, maybe use the same way, is that you have a huge template and then you misspell something or you camel paste incorrectly, it just like fails silently in the background. Does it give you like an error, like kind of like React, where it will actually yell at you and tell you what
Yes, it will give you an error. Hold on, I'm trying to think of the best way to trigger that error. Oh, wait a minute. God, I'm looking at the v4. Sorry. Oh my God, I can't get my code to fail.
Yeah, you gotta mess with your model.
Kind of a roundabout answer to that, though, which is something I really like about Vue is it's really easy to make smaller components and put them together, and so it kind of makes it easier to find those errors because you have a smaller file.
Yeah.
Right, definitely.
It does actually.
Yeah, so one of the things that is absolutely correct, and as you get massive applications, like the smaller and more concise you can make the logical pieces of your application, the better. Both for troubleshooting and also just for conceptualization. So one of the nice things about Vue is that you get really nice error messages that like will do their best to explain exactly where the error is happening, both in the console and then also in the browser, and then also in your terminal as well. So, and I can't say that every single message is completely understandable and perfect, but I can say that the vast majority of them are like, you know what, like you see the error and you know exactly what it is whenever it happens.
Does it do it in the layout though, or just in the script block? Right, because that's the problem with Angular. Like if you mistype your V model up there, right, like in Angular, you mistype your bind, then you don't actually know without doing a bunch of magic to try to figure out what's actually getting rendered on it, right?
Yeah, I'm
just, it's always my big problem.
Yeah, under pressure, I'm having a hard time to remember exactly how to get those fails. But there are error messages that you will get with Vue where it says there's something jacked up in your template. It can't do, or like a lot of times it can't do the exact pinpointing that it can with the JavaScript, but it will do its best to say, okay, here's this block of markup that has an error in it, and right about here, There's a, like, that's where you should start looking. So it does its best. Okay. So did that kind of help explain like just the very basics of how Vue is working? So like that simple linking is what everything else is building off of. So I think that it's good to know that that's working, or know how that works. So so talking a little bit broader about the concepts behind Vue and behind two-way data binding and stuff like that is the MVVM pattern, which stands for model, view, view model. So all the stuff that we already looked at. It is the separation of concerns in this particular architectural pattern. It is the model, which is the data that we are concerned with, the view, which is the UI that we're rendering out, and then the view model, which is our presentation logic to make the two talk to each other and organize this stuff. Like this little graphic that I drew a while ago and that I can't remember all the stuff that it says basically explains out in a little bit more detail the concept of two-way binding. So really what we were looking at in the previous slide is like, yeah, when you change it in the view, it changes in your data, and whenever you change it in your data, it changes in your view. But what's happening is the model and the view model are separate. When we look at the code, so the view model is this JavaScript object that we're exporting, but the model itself is actually just this this JavaScript object. You could pull this out, make it separate from what we're exporting, and just reference it, and it would still work because conceptually it is separate from the view model. The reason why I write it like this, I need to stop highlighting. The reason why I put it directly in is just because that's the typical convention. But whenever we get to shared states, you'll see that we pull part of that out and then use that to share between components. But whenever we talk about the model within MVVM structure and within Vue specifically, it is nothing more than a JavaScript object. There's nothing special about it. You can just say, like, let's see. So and I have to spread out because they're just at the root level. This should work exactly the same.
Is there a reason why you spread it instead of just returning it?
Because if I just put it in like this.
No.
Oh yeah, yes, that's a way less complicated way of.
In a real application, though, you might want additional properties added to that, which is.
Yeah, so all we're doing is returning this object, and then Vue binds onto that object. And in the background, it has it's putting getters and setters on each of the data properties, and that's what it uses to coordinate the data updates. So I call out the MVVM pattern separate from. I call it the MVVM pattern separate from just the two-way data binding because it actually changes a little bit of how you think about structuring your application. So if I switch over to, oh, that looks like changed some stuff, sorry. So if I switch over to this other color picker, to give context, what we're looking at now is what I'm calling a predefined color picker. So we have a couple of predefined colors that we can pick from. but then we have the option of saying, I want a custom color and getting that old picker and being able to use it. So just an extension of the idea that we had before. But now we're dealing with a different thing. We're dealing with both the color that we want to assign, but then also a way of picking that color from a predefined list. So whenever we look at this this example in the context of model view model architecture, we have the same bindings that we had before. So the background color for the elements, the color picker whenever we're using a custom color, but now we have a select tag so that we can pick from those different color options. So here, like in this example, I'm bringing in two new concepts. One of them is Vuetify, which is a component library for Vue, which simplifies doing this imperative select tag and then looping over all of the color options, which is perfectly fine. We could say, all right, for all of the color options in this particular array, let's pull each of them out and refer to each instance as an option, and then as we're looping through it, the value for this option element is going to be that one particular option, and then we're also going to spit it out so the user can see it. So instead of doing all of this with Vuetify, we could say, well, we want to select component. We want to call it color. I don't even have a label on this. And then we know that for every select, you're going to have a series of items that you want to spit out as options. So here are the options that you're going to spit out, and whenever you modify it, modify the type. Just like the select here, whenever you select an option, it'll be bound to the type. The other new thing that we're bringing in is pug, and if it's difficult to read, then I apologize, because everything from here on out is written in pug. But really, if you've not seen pug before, it's a way of saying, all right, if HTML is a pyramid where you're nesting down till you get to the element at the bottom. So like your body, your div, your other div, your span where you have something that you're saying, and then you're closing all those tags to come down the other side of the pyramid. Pug is like saying, all right, only give me the first half of the pyramid and then take all the extra characters off. So we're still looking at an HTML element here, a custom element that we're calling vcard, and a nested card media, a nested title. We're just not having to come back down the other side, and we're not having to put the carrots on either end. The attributes work the same way, like this. Ugh. The only reason I belabor this is because it's going to be all the examples that we see. So the way you would see this HTML tag, it's the same thing. We don't need this angle bracket. We don't need this angle bracket. Within the parentheses, put all of your attributes. That's it. So we've got our template that's going to become our view, and then now down here, because we're thinking with a view model, we can think about the one thing that we're concerned about, which is color. I don't want two data elements, which is a predefined color data element and a custom color data element. They're really conceptually the same thing. I want property. I want one color property, and I want two different ways of setting that. So in my template, both for the select element, I want to, whenever I'm using this custom text field, so our input field, I want to bind to color, and whenever I show the background, I want to bind to color. And then whenever I'm in my view model, I want to bind to color. So what we're saying here is, let's see. So we're looking at type right now, a computed property. So remember, this is what I was saying, where type is treated like a data property, as if it was up here sitting next to color, but we're giving it a formula to spit out instead of just a regular string or number or something like that. So what we're saying is, for the type property, which is attached to our select statement, so whenever we change this select to pick one of those predefined values, it's going to update the type property. Whenever we set a new type, it's going to pass through this function and say, okay, grab the current color, and then for the new type string that we're passing in, if the type is white, then like overwrite the color with that particular hexadecimal value. Walk through each of our predefined values and set their associated hexadecimal value. If the type isn't any of these, we know that it's one of the custom, or it's just a custom color that we're picking. So keep what it was before. Don't overwrite it at all, and then set the color to whatever is in the color variable. And then after we're done, so we're setting color variable, but we're not in the color property at all. We're in type. So we want to say, okay, and then also set the selected color type to this particular type element. So our selected color type, and then that data property is just, should I show the custom field or no? Like if I selected any of these, then it doesn't make this conditional true. So if the selected color type is specifically custom, then show this input field. Otherwise, hide it. And that's why whenever we have one of these predefined values, we don't see that, but only when we select custom do we see it. So we're able to minify the number of data properties that we're worried about. We're able to link to the different data properties to accomplish the business logic that we have, and outside of all these comments I put in that you could read later, there's actually not a whole lot of logic that's needed to build this up. That's it. Then there's a little bit of style, and that's it. This whole file is really just this template, this little bit of set data, this computed property, and style. So having this pattern allows you to kind of compact and in a very minimal way accomplish an interactive UI.
This is slightly off topic, but how do some of the kind of common JavaScript tools deal with the syntax? For example, can you run asynchronous code? Can you run Prettier?
Yes, Prettier is running right now. Okay. So yep. So it.
Is it the code cut and script blocks, right?
Yeah. So it. We can say this is the section of this particular component that is JavaScript, so use JavaScript tools on it. There's an ancillary tool that I'll bring up later, but I don't want to run super long, and I thought it was going to be farther through, so I'm going to keep going. Debugging. We've already looked at a little bit of the debugging as far as using the Chrome Dev Tools to pop open our. Make sure that I'm back to, okay. Being able to pop open the Chrome Dev Tools to drill down and look at our specific component, look at the data properties, interact with the data properties. Why don't you let me set it? You get the idea. I would normally be able to set these. I'm not going to debug it now. And kind of like walk through it in media res as we're interacting with our component, seeing how everything changes. So, so the Chrome Dev Tools is a very important one. The hot module reloading. As I've been building, this out or changing the files and stuff like that, you'll notice I didn't have to hit refresh every single time. The Webpack setup does hot module reloading. It will retain the state that you have while updating the various pieces of code that you've changed. It will still reload everything if you make changes to like the data structure, like if you change the model, or if you change like a store, it will update everything, but it will refresh the browser for you. Very, very nice whenever you're trying to minimize your development loop as you build. And then the detailed error messages that you see in the browser console, etc. So probably look at these here. Okay. I'm not going to demo debugging because I want to make sure that we're not here all night. So we talked about the components. We talked about how the components are isolated. So we've scoped the style, we've scoped the data. All the data in this only pertains to this one component. If we were trying to get to, we can't get to any of this data from the app. And we can't get to any of the data in the app from the predefined from our child component unless we explicitly pass it in. I'm not going over past properties in this slide deck, but whenever we look at the actual project, I use it a whole bunch. What I do want to cover is the idea of shared state. So we have all these isolated pieces of structure and logic that can't talk to each other, but we know that inevitably we are going to want one component to know what's going on in another component. We don't want to couple them together because we want to be able to use these separately. We want to be able to move around. We want to be able to chop out this component from one project and put it into another project without having to do a whole bunch of rewriting. So the way that we get around that is a shared state. So the model in the MVVM pattern is separate from the view model, which means we can pull part of that model or the entire model out and put it in a place that this component A, B, and C can see, and they can bind to and they can interact with. So they see this state as part of its isolated state and have no idea that it's also interacting with any of these other components. It also allows us to retain a single source of truth. So rather than having like local data properties in one component and local data properties in another component, and then trying to keep those local properties synced, we're just saying, don't make them local. Make them available to other places and keep that as the one place that we're storing the data. So if we switch over and look at a simple shared state, so in the browser, so the demo now is a list of image data, and then whenever we click on information, we see more information about that one particular record. So the two-way data binding is still in effect in the sense that if I change Aaron, oh god, I sorted wrong. Oh god, I realized this little glitch whenever I was going back through the code. Yeah, so the two-way data binding is still in effect. We just weren't seeing it because I was updating the artist name while being sorted by the artist name, and it goes, oh, this starts with C. Move it to the C section, which moves it out of our 5-record view. But the binding is still happening, but now we're looking at two different components. So within our app, we're now looking at a list component and a detail component. Within our app component, we're saying, okay, let me import the list component from here. Let me import the detail component from here. And then this is that component section I was talking about. For this component, I am explicitly registering the list and the details. So so I can then insert them into various spots within the app. It doesn't mean that I've inherited all their data, it just means I can place them within the structure of this component. Whenever we look at the list view, we're just spitting out a list of table data rows and a button to click on to say select this particular item. Our data property has our column headers that we want to put in place. It also has like a primed couple of images. These are being replaced immediately. I just wanted there to be something to see. If we were really building this out, this would just be an empty array that we stack together. And then the method for what to do whenever you select a particular item, and then a lifecycle hook that says, okay, after this component has been created, before it's been rendered to the DOM, make an AJAX call using the Axios library, and then once you get the response for it, shove it into the image property. And then I do a little map over it so that I can organize the properties and name them the way that I want to match what I'm expecting up here and up in the template. But really it's just saying, go out, get data, shove it into this data property, and then you're done. So that's what's rendering out the list. So that gives us our list, but this data is isolated. This is local to this particular component. Whenever we select one, we want to share it with the details view, which is this component that's just, here's the structure of that detail view where we can see the image, we can see the different pieces of that particular record, their text fields, so we can interact with them, and that's it. We don't even have local data properties in this particular one. We just have a shared state, which is what we'll talk about next. So to allow the two components to share that information, we pull those pieces out of the model in the list and put them into a shared state, which again is just a JavaScript object. We have a piece of the state that is whatever object is currently selected, like whatever we shove into here, and then whether or not we should show details, which defaults to false, which is why they don't show at the same time whenever it's first rendered. So whenever we click the select, let's see, so in here we're rendering out our list, and then one of the things that we get is a button, that eye icon. Whenever we click on that button, we want to fire the set selected object selected item method within this view model, and then we want to pass this particular item, like whatever item that we're currently on in the iteration of spitting all these rows out, we want to insert this one particular item. Whenever we fire that method, we say, okay, we know we're going to get the item passed to us, so show the details, and then take that item and then put it into the shared state. And then in the details view, we pull out the shared state, and then we reference, let's see, I have a computer property that is just the item, so that if nothing is selected, we're just returning an empty object. But if there is something that's selected, we're going to just return that JavaScript object. And then that is what we're going to use to say, this is your URL, your title, your artist, etc. So whenever we look at this in our dev tools, we will see our isolated list component with our array of images. They have their own specific data properties. We see the shared state that has a selected item in it currently with all of its data properties. And then when we look at the detail view, we could still see that shared state with its with those same data properties, because it's literally looking at the exact same object. Make sense?
So I guess you had the option to write those components so that the data they needed would be passed into it instead of using the shared state. Is it fair to say that if you use shared state, you kind of made that component less reusable? You can't just plug it out of that app and use it in some other app easily.
Yeah, I think in a way it makes it a little it makes it less mobile, because you're depending on the shape of that shared state. When you look at the store pattern, it becomes a little bit more mobile because you're referencing like helper functions to refer to the shared state. But yeah, it definitely does. The thing that the shared state has the advantage of over it is that if you're passing in data properties, you're assuming a specific direction as far as how they're structured. With the shared state, the two components could be like sitting next to each other, not well, when you're using the shared state.
Chris, you need to plug in.
Oh God. When you're using the shared state, these two components don't need to be nested within each other. They can sit next to each other and still see the same stuff. But yeah, it is a consideration that you would need to take in.
Is Vuex another approach to achieve that?
Yep. Yeah. Vuex is the next thing that we're going into.
I think that's a great question. I don't think there's like a perfect
Chris.
answer. But,
Oh, yes.
I feel like there's some components are like super usable, like the unified framework, and I mean those are always. It's kind of just like spectrum, like how generic are the components you're making that you want to use across like a zillion projects versus like, oh, I'm just making a component. It's not really reusable. I'm just making a module so it's easy to work with, and it's like just for this. And I don't know. That's my experience. Because you can still have props. You can still pass data through properties, and maybe there's just like some local data, like maybe some other like UI information comes down from a parent property or from a parent component, and that one's I don't know. You can mix and match, I guess.
If you use shared state, are you making the components less reusable?
Yeah, and I think that you're right. It's a balance, and it just depends on what you're wanting to build and planning it out.
On that note, if it's shared state component or property definitions, does it mark the application or does it just
Yes, or well, it will give you an error message saying you're looking for properties that don't exist. Because whenever you're doing this kind of a simple shared state, you're importing this just like you would import any other JavaScript module, but then you're shoving it into the local data property, which essentially just makes it local. If you're not familiar with ES6 syntax, this is what we're doing. We're saying take this imported shared state and then shove it into a local module. So whenever you reference it, if it's not there, it's going to say, well, I'm looking for my local shared state dot whatever, and it's not there.
What control do you have over that interaction between UI shared state and memory? And I ask because, so in your example, when you started typing something in, presumably it's resorting at all of those 1,000 items after. Is there a way in this process that you can put something in the middle that says don't understand this shared state?
Yeah, there are a couple. In this particular example, I would probably, yeah, like pull the, instead of doing the direct binding, either doing a computed property or even a method to do it that can do it to bounce to wait for you to like stop typing. In other instances, you could also use things like view next tick, which is like a set timeout 0 to have it wait until the rest of the task list is done running. But yeah, it's something that you would probably have to explicitly intercept. A good question.
You are doing the key down or key up, right?
It's doing it. Let's see. Like, I'm not saying when to do it. It's just like because we're binding it. I can't remember under the hood if it does key down or key up, but
under the hood is the change event.
okay.
Which is like it's like key up, but it also works if you paste in something.
And then this is hearsay, but I know on most browsers it's actually naturally devised. So it doesn't fire off change until somebody stops typing or something. It's not always true, but I haven't.
That's good things to know. I did not know either of those. So, a shared state can be done really simply by just sharing a JavaScript object between two components. But it does have some downsides. It means that you run into issues where you need to know the data properties of that shared state. Regardless of how deep it goes, you have to understand the structure of that shared state. And it means that if you modify that shared state, now you have multiple spots to update those data properties, which is not great. It also means that it becomes harder to determine what triggered the change. If both of these components are tied to this one particular data property, which one of these just set that value, and like how do you track that? And then you are handing off the logic of setting those data properties to the individual components. So if there is some special logic that you need to fire before you actually set that shared property, that has to be handled at both component levels, and now you have to keep those in sync. Or if I'm working on one half of the application and then someone else is working on the other half, and I put in like a validation that happens to this one particular data property, and then they don't put it in, now we don't have a complete app. We don't have synchronicity of the presentation or client-side business logic. So that's where you would evolve to a store pattern. I don't think I have it in this slide. There's a really nice example of like a really simple store pattern that I meant to put in and didn't. But basically, it is taking that concept of a simple shared state and then pulling in the interactions for manipulating that state and accessing that state, pulling it into the shared state file itself, and becoming more than just a JavaScript object. It is a JavaScript object, and then the methods used to interact with it.
There's that one on, like if you watch, I think it's on Egghead, the guy that wrote Redux, Dan Abramov.
Mm-hmm.
He has like a 30-minute video. Wait, it's like a bunch of 2-minute videos that he goes and shows you, like, doesn't use React, but it's just like, here's how it works. And you basically write the state, you basically write Redux like, in his little video. And I think it's like a good explanation because he goes through, like, here's how all the updates work. You know, he goes, I don't know, it's a good,
Nice.
if you haven't used state before, I think Redux is a little bit more complicated, but he goes under the hood to show you like how the pattern works and kind of how state updates should be done.
Nice.
That's like that.
The video is really good.
If one of you could post a link for that video in the meetup,
jSTL.
yeah, that'd be great.
It's free. Yeah, it's just like I'll he wrote
Just
like
because I can see.
You just use the view model and only affect your view model with methods. Isn't that like a state manager right there?
It is for that local state. As soon as you share that local state outside of it.
The application, you have like a master, and I'm not experienced with Vue, I'm experienced with Mac.js, and so
Mm-hmm.
just like similar, but if you have your view model, and then you've got stuff that's acting on that view model through methods, so you know everything goes through those methods.
Oh, yeah,
You
yeah.
work on making that view model. You don't have a list of what methods happen in sequence, which I think you do.
Yeah,
But
interesting.
It is a basic state machine, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of like the Redux style things. They just tell they're just like, oh, you should name your functions here and or name your actions here and all this stuff. I think it's the same exact thing.
More
You have
robust.
an object and it has an interface. It's just like a way of a style of defining your interface. But I think it's I mean what you described.
Is there a word for it?
It does the same
the full
thing.
stack dev.
That's
Where
more
you
Oh,
around
oh,
it.
yeah, yeah.
I found that class. It's right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Ooh,
think that is
nice.
right, but in my
I would
experience,
post
one
it
of
to
the
the
main
Meetup group.
reasons in the React space
There's not a
to
specific
use
channel
Redux instead of
in
just
SEO
using
tech
your
for
own
this
state
group.
is the fact that you have dev tools that you can go to at any point and see what is in the state right now. That's a huge
Yeah,
advantage just to have a dev tool.
Yes, let's look at that.
Yeah, that's the benefit of having more rules than saying, oh, you have to do it this way, then yeah, you can build tooling around it because you know it's going to work that way.
So I didn't go through and build a specific demo for Vuex, mostly because I got the okay to show the project that I've been working on, and there's a lot of Vuex code that we could take a look at it. Just recently, we launched the new Paradowski.com website that we rebuilt. I did not build the front end portion of it. I built the content editor that we're using to build the content from scratch, using Vue and Vuex and a couple of other tools. So, but all of this, like even on the front end, is rendered out using Vue components and stuff. So the content editor for this, which looks super ugly because I started with a proof of concept and then we got far enough along and my boss said, we need to be able to use that right now. So I bolted on stuff to make it a functional proof of concept, but still kind of ugly. Yeah, and luckily I got the okay to come back later and actually build it out formally, and I refused to move it outside of the prototype folder because it's like, this is not going to be the final version of this tool, but like, and that is all I will say about it. I'm not going to get on a soapbox. But this is the content editor. So the idea is that you have a series of different block types that allow you to organize your information in various ways. And then instead of having like either a mock representation of what you're seeing, or just just tools that bolt on top of this, you can actually go through and modify the real components that you're going to see on the front end as if they were just just a giant text editor that's styled in specific ways. There are different properties that you can add to it, like as you click on the different blocks, you get properties that you could set as far as what video source that you have, whether or not to autoplay or mute, various things that are specific to those component types. You get some of the, why are you not, it's that full screen issue that I was having before. Sorry. So some of the examples that I was using before to show came out of building some of the bits and pieces of this particular application. Yeah, so and once you build this, and yes, I am on local, thankfully. So once you build out your page, let's see. You can then go through, update it, and then see it on the front end site the same way you saw it. Slight style things because Vuetify is inserting some style stuff, but see it on the front end, and all of a sudden all of that editability is gone. So to build out that more sophisticated application, you can't do just a simple shared state. There are too many different components that need to interact with the same data. So that's where you bring in a state management tool like Vuex. So within, oh, that is not the code base. Did I just close it? Okay. So we're looking at a lot of the same component structure that we were seeing before, like defining custom components and inserting them into specific places of other component templates. But then we have the concept of a store. So the store is the state. So our shared state that we were looking at before is still just a JavaScript object, but then also a couple of other sets of tools that we can use to interact with that state. We have getters, which are just functions that return either data from within the store or even just data period. Like they don't necessarily need to come, or sorry, data from within the state or just data period. It doesn't even need to come from the state. But now we're getting past that problem where if I use this getter called selected block instance, it doesn't matter if selected block is at the root of the state or it's way far down, nested in various JavaScript objects, because now I just have this one function to refer to return that. The logic for and the reasoning for how this is organized within the state is encapsulated within the store. We also have actions and mutations. These are similar to the methods when it comes to actually modifying the store's state. It's just that with actions we are able to do, let's see, we're able to do asynchronous actions before we actually modify the state. I'm trying to find one that has some asynchronous action. So various processes to do before we actually say oh, this is actually just returning stuff. Various actions to do before we say commit this change to the state. And then we have mutations, which is the actual functions that are going to change the state. Like, so this is where we can say update this particular property of the state. Whenever you're with Vuex, you only modify the state from a mutation, because Vuex then says, well, you're not actually modifying the state. I'm going to create a new instance of the state and then give that to you. And mutations are the way that you can tell it to record.
Do you have to write a getter for everything you want to achieve?
Nope. Let's see. Taking a look at one of these isolated components. Let's see. So here's that concept of props that we were talking about. Instead of using a shared state to pass in information, we can actually say pass in this property. And within our let's see. Within our component that's actually rendering out each of these block instances, we can say, okay, render out each of the block instances, name it instance, and then set these properties on this actual div, but then pass in this prop called instance. So the data is actually being passed in here, and we just happen to be labeling that prop the same name as this variable, and that is what in here comes in as instance. So we now have access to this within our isolated state. We can also use things like Vuex comes with helper methods to say, okay, I want to pull out pieces of the store and then add them to my local state as if they were part of my local state. So this selected block instance comes from a state module and then is added as a computed property.
Instance is
yep.
a copy of what that's saying, right? It's not passed by reference.
No, it's passed by reference. So when you mutate,
instance in the child component, it updates in parent?
yes, it does. And that is why whenever you're using something like Vuex, it is suggested that you use a computed property method. Oh, this is not a good example. Let's see. So whenever we're setting information that's actually stored within a store's state, we can use a computed property to say, okay, whenever we're referring to background position X, refer to it, like be able to bind it to our view as if it's a regular property, and then pull it out of the store like you would a regular property. But then whenever you go to set it, actually pass it off to a mutation to handle the setting of that. It will set it in the store state, and then when the re-render happens, it will update the template with that information. This set background position X is a method being pulled in, is a mutation being pulled in from this particular store module and then added as if it's a local method. So we're actually firing the method or handing off to the method in the store, but we're able to write it as if it's a local method. In addition to having one big store, which can get large and unwieldy, like the store in this one, like the global store is pretty large and unwieldy, you can also carve out specific store modules. So I have a set of store actions I want to happen for this one particular component. So I can say create this image set store model or module, and then still put in actions that are specific to this image set component, mutations that are specific to this image set component, organize them here, becomes a much smaller file, and then within my global store, I'm able to import that module, and then whenever I actually instantiate the global store, just say, okay, take that image set module and then shove it in, like nest it in with the rest of the global one. And that's how you can start composing these stores. So you don't end up with these nicely isolated components, but then a gigantic unwieldy store. You can actually separate out both. Let's see. As far as debugging goes, we still have, now we have a little bit more detail to see within the Vue dev tools, which is where these dev tools really shine. Being able to walk through and see, let's see, it's gonna scroll, oh, wait a minute, yeah, we can't, oh, there we go. Being able to see a particular component, have it highlighted, look at the data for that one component instance, which is getting a little bit more complex, see the Vuex specific bindings, and then being able to see the overall store. So this is the store state. And whenever I say that we create a new instance of the store's state as we interact with it, this is what I'm meaning. As I type through here, we're creating a unique instance of that store's state that we can then go back and forth through to see the individual changes as they're happening. So if we did something like start on a new page so it's not nearly as overwhelming. So insert a couple of things to look at. So as we go through and start changing some of these, oh, no, leave that muted. So we weren't recording because I didn't have the DevTools open. As we start changing some of these, and you can even see it as I'm selecting things. The mutation of selecting a particular instance and going through and, well, let's just like delete some of these. Being able to come through and see all that being recorded and going back to that previous state. Now that we're recording all of that, we can step back and forth, which ends up making debugging a hell of a lot easier. If you're doing things like adding in undo and redo features, It makes it a lot easier because you're just walking backwards and forwards within the stored state. And then one of the things that all of this allows you to do is when I go through all of this data here, all of these individual modules that make up this application are all just a way of building up an array of JSON objects that are then going to be saved to the server and then re-rendered on the front end. So now, instead of saving absolutely everything that's happening, I only need to save these block instances that we're building up. The AJAX call for saving this literally just grabs this array, shoots it up to the server, stores it in the database. The front end render to spit all those out literally says, hey, give me that JSON object, parse it so that I can walk through it, and then use those same Vue components, those exact same pieces of code to render it out on the front end. Just don't render all the editing tools as well, and shove data in as you need. I know that's a lot. We could probably dive even further in, but it's already very late, and I want to cover the rest of it. So we talked about the store pattern. The other major part whenever you're building a large-scale web app is the ability to move back and forth through parts of your project. In the demo code, let's see. So there's a simple example of a front-end router, which is just taking the different pieces that we've already seen and allowing us to navigate in between them. You'll notice as I navigate between these pieces, it's actually updating the URL. It also updates the URL history, so now our back and forth buttons become navigation as well. This is done via the Vue router tool. Which shown simply is just a way of saying, okay, I have these specific routes that correspond to these paths. Whenever you go to this path, render out this particular component. All the stuff that we were looking at before. And in our app, we're rendering out buttons to click that will navigate us back and forth, and then we have the spot where those components are going to get rendered out, and then from here it's the regular view structure that we were looking at before. There's not really a whole lot more to it, and I don't want to lose any more people. So while we were looking at all this, we actually looked at almost all of these ancillary tools. So Vue's a library, Vuex is doing a store, Router is doing the client-side routing and stuff like that. But there are also the command line tools. Like whenever I create these demos and stuff like that, I'm not writing all of that from the ground up. You can say you can use Vue CLI tools to say, create a new Vue project that is using a Webpack structure, name it this, and it will spit out the scaffold for you and allow you to essentially start from having everything in place in that app component that you're now manipulating and adding to and stuff like that. All of your Webpack config is already written for you. I didn't touch the Webpack config for the demo at all because I don't like DevOps stuff. You can add to it if you want, but it'll give you a good starting point. If you were going to explore Vue, I would highly suggest starting with the Vue CLI tool so you get that leg up and you can dive right into Vue. The dev tools in Chrome, which we looked at, same dev tools are available in Firefox. Vuetify, which are those Vue components that we looked at. Just really quickly to show. Vuetify, I want to show Vuetify's website specifically because not only is it a bunch of really nice components, but it's a bunch of really nice functional examples of how to use those components and how to structure them within your application. So being able to come through here and see and interact with each of these things live is pretty nice. And then things like Electron Vue. If you want to build Electron applications and use Vue to do the UI portion of it, you could do that. I've done that with a number of things. It's very nice. Weeks, which is kind of like React Native for building native mobile apps. Vueter, which is the formatter that we were seeing in VS Code to do the highlighting for .vue files, and then the style guide, which I talked about before. So the links for all of this stuff that we looked at, plus a couple of other small things, are at the end of the slide deck. I will post the link to the slide deck and the link to the GitHub that has all of the code outside of the content editor that we looked at tonight. The master branch has everything put together, but you can dive into any of these branches to look at the isolated pieces that we were looking at. And getting up and running with it is just installing the dependencies and running npm run dev. Trello board is here. If you like, please add topics to it. I and the other organizers and Stephanie will work to cover topics. If you want to volunteer for a talk, you can add that there. You can message us directly. You can come over to my house. I don't care. If you want to find me to ask questions, I sit on Twitter a bunch. And I sit in STL site. And that's all I had. It's not tomorrow yet. Yay! Okay. Yeah. Sorry that ran long. I have a hard time keeping track of time. So, is there? I mean, I can keep going if I want. Yes. Oh, yes. Damn. You know what?